She has been awake since before dawn, standing in the dark outside her tent, listening. Not to the wind. The wind has been there for weeks. She has stopped hearing the wind the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. She is listening for something else, for a sound she cannot name but will recognize when it comes. Her name is Bodil Mortensen. She is 14 years old. She left Denmark months ago, not with her own parents, but with the Harvey Clough family, following a faith she was just beginning to understand. She has crossed the North Atlantic, walked across Iowa, and has been pushing a wooden handcart for 3 months. She has 4 ounces of flour left. It is October 19th, 1856, and Bodil Mortensen has exactly 4 days left to live. What do you do when everything you were promised turns out to be true, and also costs more than anyone told you? Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives, where we find the real human beings inside the historical record, to tell stories not as mythology, not as cautionary tale, not as simple triumph or simple tragedy, but as documented truth in all its complexity. The Handcart story has been told many times within the community that carries it most closely, primarily as an act of devotion. If you are new to this channel, consider subscribing, and we want to know what you think. Leave a comment with this question. Is there a difference between faith and recklessness? Where is the line? The people in this story disagreed about that question, loudly and at the worst possible moment. We would like to know where you would draw it. Now, back to Wyoming, back to October, back to the moment before the snow started. There is a particular kind of suffering that does not announce itself dramatically. It does not arrive with a single catastrophic moment that defines everything before and after. It arrives the way cold arrives on the Wyoming high plains, gradually, then all at once. Each small increment unremarkable on its own until the accumulation becomes something the body cannot answer. The 1856 handcart disaster arrived that way. It was not caused by a single decision or a single failure. It was caused by a cascade, a ship that crossed the Atlantic 3 weeks late, a rail connection missed in the American East, green timber used where seasoned wood was needed, a July calendar that everyone looked at and read differently. Each delay was individually survivable. Together, they were fatal for somewhere between 200 and 250 people who left Iowa City in the summer of 1856 and never reached the Salt Lake Valley. More than 800 others did reach it, and what those survivors endured in getting there, what they did for each other, what it cost them, what it made of them, is one of the most extensively documented stories of human endurance in the history of westward expansion. To understand how more than 1,000 people came to be pushing wooden carts across the Wyoming high country in late October of 1856, you have to go back 3 years, to Salt Lake City, to a problem that had been building since the first pioneer wagons rolled into the valley in 1847, and to a decision made in the autumn of 1855 that seemed, at the time, like a solution. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had been sending missionaries to Great Britain and Scandinavia since the early 1840s, and those missionaries had been extraordinarily successful. By the mid-1850s, the number of British and Scandinavian converts waiting to emigrate to Utah, waiting for the financial means to make a journey that cost, by the standard wagon and oxen method, roughly $1,000 per family in mid-19th century figures, had grown into the tens of thousands. For converts who were poor, who were laborers and factory workers and domestic servants and farmhands, $1,000 was not a difficult sum. It was an impossible one. The Perpetual Emigrating Fund, established by the Church in 1849, was designed to address exactly this problem. It functioned as a revolving loan program. The church would finance an emigrant's passage and supplies on credit, and the emigrant would repay the fund once established in Utah, freeing that money to finance the next emigrant. The concept was sound. The execution was chronically underfunded, perpetually behind demand, and, by 1855, carrying substantial accumulated debt. The 1855 Utah harvest had been poor. Drought had stressed community resources, and the waiting list of converts in Britain and Scandinavia kept growing faster than the fund could address it. There were thousands of people in England and Denmark and Sweden and Wales who had joined the church, who had been told that gathering to Zion, to the valley in the Rocky Mountains, was not merely a good idea, but a religious obligation, who believed with the full conviction of new converts that the community their prophet was building in the mountains was where God wanted them, and who could not afford to get there. In September of 1855, Brigham Young wrote a letter that would change everything. In it, he proposed a solution that was radical in its simplicity. Instead of wagons pulled by oxen, church immigrants could walk. They would pull and push simple, lightweight, two-wheeled carts carrying their belongings. The carts could be built cheaply from local timber. They required no draft animals, no harness, no teamster, no feed. The emigrants themselves would be the engines of their own migration. Young estimated the cost at between $9 and $11 per person, a fraction of the wagon route, and he framed the proposal not merely as practical, but as spiritually significant. Faith, he argued, was more reliable than oxen. The body, sustained by righteousness, could accomplish what the doubting mind would call impossible. He cited the ancient Israelites crossing their own wilderness on foot, sustained by covenant and by manna. The latter-day saints would be sustained by the same. The letter was read to congregations across Britain. It was published in the church's periodical press, and it was received by thousands of converts who had been waiting years for their chance to gather to Zion. They said yes. Overwhelmingly, passionately, they said yes. To understand why, you have to understand what life looked like for working-class converts in 1850s England and Scandinavia. The mid-19th century in industrial Britain was not a comfortable era for ordinary people. Factory workers in Birmingham and Manchester lived in cramped, smoke-saturated tenements on wages that did not reliably cover the cost of food. Agricultural laborers in the rural counties lived in conditions that had changed little since the previous century. Children worked from young ages. Adults wore out young. Economic mobility, in any meaningful sense, was not available to most people through ordinary means. Into this world, the latter-day saint missionaries had come with a message that was not purely theological. Yes, there was spiritual salvation, but there was also, literally and practically, Zion, a place in the American mountains where God's people were building a new kind of community, where land was available, where the class distinctions of the old world were supposed to give way to a community of equals working toward a shared purpose, where a Yorkshire factory worker or a Danish farm laborer could own ground and work it for themselves. For converts who believed this, and many believed it, with the full conviction of people who have found the first genuinely hopeful thing they have ever encountered, the prospect of walking 1,300 miles to reach it was not an absurdity. It was a sacrifice commensurate with the stakes. And when Brigham Young said they could get there for $11 by pulling a handcart, the question for most of them was not whether to go. It was how soon. The plan, in its essential architecture, was sound. Emigrants would sail from Liverpool to New York or Boston, travel by rail to the outfitting point in Iowa City, Iowa, receive their handcarts and supplies, and begin walking west in early June. The Mormon Trail, which ran parallel to and sometimes overlapping with the Oregon Trail, following the north bank of the Platte River across Nebraska and into Wyoming, was an established route by 1856. If emigrants left Iowa City by early June, they would cross the Missouri River by late June, cross Nebraska through the summer heat, reach the Wyoming high country by late August or early September, cross South Pass, the broad, gentle summit of the Continental Divide, in September, and descend into the Salt Lake Valley before the winter snows arrived in earnest. The timing was tight. It was not comfortable, but it was possible. What actually happened in 1856 was a cascade of delays, each one individually manageable, collectively catastrophic. The ship Thornton, carrying the emigrants who would form the Willie Company, left Liverpool on May 4th, 1856. A second ship, the Horizon, carrying the future Martin Company, left on May 25th. Both crossings were difficult. Steerage accommodations on mid-19th century emigrant ships were not designed for comfort. They were designed to fit as many paying bodies as possible into the space below the waterline. Passengers slept in tiered wooden berths, ate food that was often insufficient in quantity and suspect in quality, and breathed air that circulated through the crowded space with reluctant inadequacy. The North Atlantic in spring is not a gentle sea. Seasickness struck nearly everyone in the first days out of Liverpool. Dysentery followed, spreading through the crowded quarters with the efficiency of a disease that requires only contaminated water and proximity to move from person to person. In some cases, measles broke out among the children. At least one child died on the Thornton crossing. The parents buried their child at sea and continued to the destination. There was nothing else to do. By the time the Thornton docked in New York in mid-June, the emigrants had been at sea for 6 weeks and were weakened by the crossing. They needed to travel by rail from New York to Iowa City, a journey of several days that should have been straightforward but was not. The American railroad network in 1856 was extensive but imperfectly coordinated, and connections were missed in the particular way that 19th century rail connections were missed, with no warning, no recourse, and no timeline for the next departure. Delays accumulated with the patient indifference of a system not designed for the urgency of the people moving through it. The Willie Company did not arrive in Iowa City until late June, 3 weeks past the latest advisable departure date for a safe handcart crossing. The Martin Company arrived even later, in early July. Both companies had been traveling since May. They were already dangerously behind schedule before they had taken a single step on the trail they had come to walk. In Iowa City, they found the handcarts waiting. And here, a second problem became apparent to anyone who looked carefully enough to see it. The carts had been built from green, unseasoned wood. This was not a cosmetic flaw, it was structural. Anyone who has worked with timber understands what green wood does as it dries. It shrinks. Joints that fit tightly when assembled loosen as moisture leaves the grain. Wheels that roll smoothly in July will develop gaps and warped spokes over the weeks and miles that follow. The axles of these carts, the critical load-bearing elements that had to sustain hundreds of pounds of cargo across 1,300 miles of rough terrain, were also made of wood rather than iron, because iron was expensive and the church's budget for the handcart program was constrained. Experienced frontiersmen in Iowa City walked among the stacked carts and said so plainly to anyone in a position to act on the information. They described what would happen to green axles on Platte Valley caliche and Wyoming rock under sustained weight and friction. They were specific. They were not being alarmist. They were describing material reality. Some people listened. The leadership of the emigrant companies, men whose expertise was ecclesiastical rather than frontier practical, processed this information through a framework that prioritized faith over mechanical precaution. They believed God would sustain what human preparation left wanting. They were not cynical in this belief. They were sincere. But sincerity and accuracy are different properties, and in the material world of wooden axles on rough terrain, accuracy is the one that matters. Among those who listened and who drew his own conclusion from what he heard and saw was a man named Levi Savage. Levi Savage was 42 years old in 1856. He was not a typical member of the emigrant companies. He was a veteran church missionary who had traveled extensively in Asia and the Pacific, to Burma, to Siam, across the Pacific, on assignments for the church. He had crossed the American plains before. He had seen what the Wyoming high country looked like in October. He had spent enough time in genuinely dangerous terrain to develop a practical, unsentimental understanding of the difference between situations that faith could transform and situations that physics governed regardless of faith. When Levi Savage looked at the calendar in late July of 1856, looked at the green wood of the handcart axles, looked at the emigrants assembled in the Iowa City outfitting grounds, among them families with elderly, grandparents, women with nursing infants, children who had been ill on the Atlantic crossing and had not fully recovered, he made a calculation. The calculation had a specific result, and the result frightened him. On August 13, 1856, at a formal meeting of company leadership convened in Florence, Nebraska, Levi Savage stood up and said what he believed to be true. He told them they should not go. He laid out his reasoning methodically: the departure date, the miles remaining, the likely arrival date in the mountain passes, the condition of the carts, the condition of the people, the documented character of October and November in the Wyoming high country. He told them that a departure in late July meant the high passes in October at the earliest, November at the latest. He told them that the carts would not survive the full crossing. He told them that the weakest members of the company, the elderly, the children, the people still ill from the Atlantic crossing, would not survive what he could see coming. He told them, as directly as the historical record shows any person saying anything, that people would die. The other senior figures at the meeting disagreed. Elder James G. Willie, who was to lead the company that bore his name, and the other presiding missionaries acknowledged Savage's concerns and then set them aside. They argued that faith had always sustained the Lord's people in extremity. They argued that the emigrants had already waited too long, had already crossed an ocean and endured months of delay, and could not be reasonably asked to winter in Iowa City with no resources, no income, and no homes to return to. They argued that going was the right choice, and that God would sustain it. The vote went against Levi Savage. What he did next is one of the most quietly remarkable moments in the entire story. He did not argue further. He did not resign. He did not withdraw to safety while the others walked into what he believed was coming. He stood up and said, in words recorded by multiple witnesses present and preserved in consistent form across multiple accounts, something close to this: I know you have voted to go. I cannot change your decision, but I will go with you. I will do everything in my power to bring you through, and if we do not reach the valley, I will die in the attempt. He kept that promise. He walked every mile. He carried children on his back when they fell behind the column's pace. He pulled carts alongside the weakest members of the company when their families could not manage the weight alone. He buried the dead with his own hands, reading scripture over frozen ground, and then picked up his own load and walked. Whether Savage found satisfaction or something more complicated in what followed, the historical record does not tell us with precision. He was right about the deaths. He was also right to stay. He seems to have understood that both things were simultaneously true, and that holding them both, without letting rightness about the danger become a reason to abandon the people walking into it, was the specific moral task the situation had handed him. The Willie Company departed Iowa City on July 15, 1856. The Martin Company departed on July 28th. Behind both of them came the Hodgetts and Hunt wagon companies, traveling by conventional wagon, carrying the heaviest community supplies and intended to serve as a mobile resource reserve for the handcart companies along the trail. In the Willie Company, organized records place the membership at approximately 500 people. The Martin Company was larger. Historical estimates range between 575 and 620, with the imprecision reflecting the difficulty of maintaining exact records for a company assembling from multiple points of origin under conditions of general organizational pressure. Between the two handcart companies and the supporting wagon trains behind them, more than 1,000 human beings were now committed to a crossing that Levi Savage had just told their leaders would kill people. Most of them had never walked more than a few miles at a time in their lives. The handcarts were simple machines, a wooden frame, 2 wheels, 5 feet in diameter for the larger carts, a crossbar at the front serving as the pulling tongue, a rectangular box mounted over the axle for belongings. Church regulations specified a maximum of 17 pounds of personal belongings per adult and 10 pounds per child. The carts themselves weighed between 60 and 100 pounds empty, loaded with community supplies distributed to each cart, tents, cooking equipment, rations. A fully outfitted cart could approach 400 pounds. To sustain the pulling of 400 pounds 15 to 20 miles per day, every day for months, the body needs fuel. The standard ration was approximately 1 pound of flour per adult per day, supplemented with smaller amounts of sugar, bacon, and dried beans when available. 1 pound of flour provides roughly 1,500 calories. A person walking 15 to 20 miles per day in variable weather requires between 3 and 4,000 calories to maintain body weight and physical capacity. The emigrants were running a caloric deficit from the first day they left Iowa City. That deficit would accumulate over weeks and months, with the merciless arithmetic of a slow drain on a fixed reserve. They didn't know this yet. In mid-July, walking out of Iowa City into the full press of Iowa summer heat, they were discovering other difficulties first. Iowa in July and August is hot, in a way that northern Europeans find genuinely startling, humid and close, heat that wraps around the body and declines to release it, that makes sleep difficult and exertion exhausting by mid-morning. The black prairie soil radiates absorbed heat in the afternoons. The insects, unbothered by the altitude or aridity that would thin them further west, were numerous and persistent. The roads, when it rained, became the particular Iowa mud that grabs at wheels and feet with determined persistence. And the carts began failing, with the frustrated precision of a man recording what he had been warned to expect. Carts stopped on the trail every day with cracked axles, loose wheel joints, frames warped by the drying of the green wood. Repairs were made on the spot. The companies had brought tools and spare parts. But each repair took time, and time was the resource the companies could least afford to spend. Despite the mechanical problems, the companies moved. The route from Iowa City ran northwest through Iowa to Florence, Nebraska, on the Missouri River, approximately 300 miles that the companies covered in roughly 3 to 4 weeks. During this segment, The emigrants established the physical and social rhythms that would define the entire crossing. The rotation of stronger members to the cart, tongue, the sharing of loads among family units, the impromptu engineering solutions to mechanical failures, the rapid camp-making in fading light and equally rapid breaking of camp in pre-dawn dark, and the singing. This is documented in multiple accounts from multiple participants, and it deserves more than passing mention. People who had walked 15 miles through August heat on inadequate rations, who were sleeping in tents on hard ground, sang hymns in the evenings, the same hymns they had sung in English parish churches and Danish village chapels and Welsh nonconformist meeting houses. The singing had a function beyond morale. It maintained the social fabric of the community, reminded people that they were not merely struggling individuals, but members of something larger, reinforced the shared identity that would prove to be a genuine survival mechanism before the crossing was finished. At Florence, Nebraska, the companies stopped to rest, to repair carts, and to assess their situation. And at Florence, as at Iowa City, experienced frontier residents looked at the calendar and the carts and the people and said the same thing Levi Savage had said in Iowa City: "Do not go." The trader, Cyrus Wheelock, reportedly told company leadership directly that the season was too far advanced. Other Florence residents with experience of the overland trails said similar things. The warnings were acknowledged, discussed, and voted down. The Willie Company crossed the Missouri River into Nebraska territory on August 18, 1856. The Martin Company followed on August 25th. They were on the plains. The clock was running, and Levi Savage was walking somewhere near the back of the column, watching the sky to the northwest. The Platte River Valley in late August and September is a landscape of genuine extremity that the word flat does not adequately describe. The river itself is famously wide and shallow, an inch deep and a mile wide, in the old saying, a braided complex of sandbars and shifting channels that runs through terrain, matching it in flatness to every horizon. The sky above is enormous in a way that affects the psychology of people who are not accustomed to unrestricted horizontal distance. For immigrants from English industrial cities or Danish farming villages, the plains were a revelation of space that was not always comfortable to inhabit. They walked through this space for weeks, day after day, 15 to 20 miles a day, the horizon retreating ahead of them at the same pace they advanced toward it. The physical conditioning that sustained walking produces over weeks is remarkable, and the historical record reflects it. By September, the emigrants who had survived the first month of the trail were genuinely stronger than they had been in Iowa City. Their feet had hardened. Their legs had adapted to the sustained demand. Their aerobic capacity had increased. They had become, under pressure, something they had not been when they started. People capable of sustained physical effort on a scale that would have seemed inconceivable in May. But adaptation has limits, and those limits are set, among other factors, by fuel. The first significant deaths occurred on the Platte. The company clerks recorded them with careful precision. Name, age, date, cause, stated in the spare terminology of frontier record-keeping. Brother William Baxter, Sister Sarah Franks. Names and ages entered in leather-bound registers by men who were themselves hungry and tired, but who understood that the record they were making would be the only monument most of these people would receive. The deaths clustered, as the historical record of sustained physical hardship consistently shows, among the elderly and the very young, not because these people were insufficient in faith or weak in character, because the specific demands of sustained marching, the caloric requirement, the cardiovascular load, the structural stress on joints, and connective tissue imposed costs that the oldest and youngest members could least afford to pay. Each death required burial. The sandy Platte Valley soil made digging easier than the frozen ground they would later face. Bodies were wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, sometimes a blanket, sometimes a piece of tent canvas. A leader would read scripture, the company would sing, and then they would pick up the cart handles and walk. By early October, when the Willie Company reached Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming, the physical deterioration of the company's most vulnerable members had become impossible to minimize. The rations had been reduced multiple times during the Nebraska crossing. An adult walking 15 to 20 miles a day through September prairie was now doing it on 10 ounces of flour, then 8, then less, fractions of what the body required, drawn against a reserve that had been declining since Iowa City. At Fort Laramie, riders from Salt Lake City met the Willie Company with letters from Brigham Young urging speed and indicating that relief would be sent from the valley. The letters also acknowledged what the company already feared: the weather ahead was going to be severe. At Fort Laramie, the company faced a decision with no good options. Wintering at the fort was theoretically possible, but they had insufficient food to sustain themselves through 8 months of encampment, inadequate shelter, and no economic means to provision themselves through the wait. The wagon companies that were supposed to be carrying additional supplies had not yet caught up. Waiting was not a safe option. Going was not a safe option. The only direction that offered any real prospect was forward, toward the valley, toward the relief parties they had been promised, toward Zion. On October 5, 1856, the Willie Company left Fort Laramie and marched west into Wyoming. The Martin Company reached Fort Laramie 4 days later. Captain Edward Martin, a veteran of earlier plains crossings who understood exactly what his company's timing meant, faced the same impossible arithmetic and reached the same conclusion: forward. Both companies pushed west into Wyoming in the first week of October, following the North Platte as it narrowed and quickened toward its mountain sources, feeling the temperature drop each night with a consistency that had the character of a countdown. The first week after Fort Laramie was hard but manageable, cold, demanding, the rations thin, but manageable. The emigrants had been walking for nearly 3 months, and their bodies had adapted in ways that surprised people who had underestimated the human body's capacity for sustained adjustment. They knew how to read the terrain ahead, how to choose the better line across a ford, how to set camp quickly in fading light and break it in the pre-dawn dark. What they could not adapt to was the continued reduction of the fuel their hardened bodies required to function. On the night of October 19, 1856, the Willie Company was camped at 6th Crossing of the Sweetwater River in central Wyoming at an elevation of roughly 6,000 feet. The Sweetwater is a tributary of the North Platte that the trail followed westward into the higher country, approaching South Pass, the broad summit of the Continental Divide. 6th Crossing sits in open terrain with no natural windbreak. Nothing between the camp and the northwest sky, where the clouds had been building since the previous afternoon in a way that the people who were watching had noted without saying aloud what they thought it meant. The storm came from the northwest. The temperature dropped before the snow started, dropped with a speed that the emigrants, most of whom had experienced hard winters in Britain and Scandinavia, nonetheless, found startling in its directness. The wind shifted and increased, and then the snow began. It did not stop. By morning, more than a foot of snow had fallen. The tents, canvas structures stressed by 3 months of daily erection and breakdown, were collapsing under the weight. The handcarts were buried to their wheel hubs. The oxen belonging to the Hunt and Hodgett's wagon companies, which had caught up with the Willie Company during the previous days, stood in the snow with their heads lowered, making the continuous low sound that working animals make when they are in sustained distress and cannot remove themselves from it. John Chislett came out of his tent on the morning after the storm and wrote down what he saw with the directness he had maintained throughout the crossing, the directness of a man who had decided that the events themselves were sufficient and required no embellishment. He described collapsed tents. He described carts buried to their axles. He described elderly members of the company lying inside fallen canvas who could not rise, not unwilling, but unable. The combination of cold, hunger, and months of accumulated physical depletion had brought them to the threshold at which the body's response to the will's commands becomes unreliable. They lay in the snow with a stillness that was different from sleep, though it was adjacently related to both sleep and to something more permanent. He described children crying from cold and hunger in a way that, he wrote years later, he could still hear when he tried to sleep. The food situation had crossed from critical to catastrophic. Adults in the Willie Company during this period were receiving, according to Chislett's account and corroborating sources, as little as 4 ounces of flour per day. 4 ounces of flour provides approximately 400 calories. A person walking 15 miles in October, Wyoming wind requires perhaps 4,000. The deficit is not a medical abstraction. It manifests in the specific documented physiology of starvation, the body consuming muscle mass for fuel, the progressive compromise of immune function, the deteriorating ability to regulate core temperature that makes cold exponentially more dangerous to a starving body than to a nourished one. The people of the Willie Company were starving in the snow, and the snow was not stopping. People began dying in numbers that outpaced the company's capacity to record them with the deliberate care they had maintained on the Platte. The grave register entries from this period are starker than the earlier ones, fewer details, dates that are sometimes approximate, the handwriting of men who were recording events faster than those events could be properly captured. Among those who did not die, and whose survival has been documented in family records and in the accounts of people who knew them in their Utah years, was Elsie Nielsen. Elsie's husband, Jens, had been frostbitten severely enough that walking had become impossible. He told her to take their son and leave without him. He told her plainly that his chances were poor, that she and the boy should save themselves, that he was giving her permission and more than permission. He was telling her this was the right thing to do. Elsie Nielsen's response is not recorded verbatim. What is recorded is what she did. She put her husband in the handcart. She picked up the tongue, and she pulled. Both of them reached the valley. Jens Nielsen became a bishop in the settlements of southern Utah. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, the visible, physical record of what the winter of 1856 had cost him. Their descendants are numerous. Their story is documented in family records, in Jens's own later accounts, and in the recollections of people who knew them in their Utah years and who understood what the limp meant. This story is one of dozens like it preserved in the records of the 1856 crossing. The pattern it represents, the choice to remain with and care for another person when individual survival calculations would counsel leaving, appears repeatedly across both companies, documented by survivors who wrote about it afterward and by the clerks who recorded sometimes who helped carry whom to the next camp. The social structure of the handcart companies, the organization into family units and sub-captains and overall leadership, the shared religious framework that defined specific obligations toward other members of the community, functioned under extreme duress as a survival mechanism. Not a perfect one, not one that saved everyone who might theoretically have been saved, but one that produced, repeatedly and documentably, acts of sustained care for others that kept people alive who would otherwise have died. The stronger pulled for the weaker. The healthy buried the dead so. The sick would not have to expend what they could not spare. When someone fell, someone stopped to help them up, even when stopping cost the helper something they could not afford. In Salt Lake City, Brigham Young received his first substantive reports about the predicament of the Willie and Martin companies at the church's October General Conference, which convened on October 4th, 1856. The writers who had passed the Handcart companies coming west carried accounts that made the situation plain. The companies were desperately late, desperately short of food, and about to walk into Wyoming winter. Young's response was rapid and comprehensive by any standard the 1856 frontier could apply. He stood at the conference and told his congregation directly what he had learned. People were dying in the mountains. The conference meeting was over. Within 2 days, wagons would be loaded with food, blankets, and clothing and headed east. Men with horses would ride ahead of the wagons to find the companies as quickly as possible. Every family in Salt Lake City with means to contribute would contribute. The relief effort was beginning that morning, not next week, not when arrangements could be made more comfortably. That morning. It left within 2 days. The organization of the rescue reflected the same communal infrastructure that had kept the Handcart companies functional through months of accumulated hardship. Young did not ask for volunteers in the tentative manner of a leader uncertain of being followed. He told his congregation what was going to happen and organized the means to make it possible. Wagons were loaded. Women stripped their homes of blankets and clothing they could not easily replace. Men left their farms in the middle of the autumn harvest to ride east into the approaching winter. George D. Grant led the rescue effort. Grant was an experienced frontiersman who knew the Wyoming terrain from multiple crossings. Riding with him were men who had spent significant time in the high country, men who understood what October looked like from the inside and could travel faster than loaded supply wagons. Among those who rode east was Ephraim Hanks. Hanks's involvement began earlier and more dramatically than the organized rescue effort, in circumstances that his later memoir attributes to spiritual prompting. He was already traveling east from Salt Lake City on a personal errand when, by his own account, he received an interior conviction that he should turn around and ride back toward companies he knew were in trouble. He turned around. He rode alone through Wyoming in October, carrying a supply of buffalo meat from a hunt conducted along the way. And he found the Martin Company before the main rescue party reached them. He found them sheltered in a hollow in the bluffs above the Sweetwater River, the place that would eventually be called Martin's Cove, where the terrain offered some protection from the worst of the wind. His memoir describes what he found there with the plain directness of a man who has decided that the facts require no elaboration. People lying in the snow inside collapsed tents, still alive. People who had died in the night and not yet been moved. Children wrapped in the coats of their dead parents. Men and women with feet and hands blackened by frostbite to a degree that removed the question of whether amputation was necessary and replaced it with the question of how soon. Hanks distributed his buffalo meat immediately. The arrival of fresh protein and fat, qualitatively different from the flour remnants that constituted the company's remaining rations, had a visible and immediate effect on people who had been at the absolute limit of caloric deprivation. Then he did something else. He had practical experience with frontier medicine. Not formal training, but the knowledge that accumulates in men who have spent years in remote terrain where professional medical care is unavailable and where doing something is consistently better than doing nothing. He examined the frost-bitten limbs of the survivors. He assessed which tissue was salvageable and which was not, and in cases where frostbite had progressed past the point where preservation was possible, he amputated, without anesthesia, in the field, in October in Wyoming. His memoir describes these procedures in the same tone he uses to describe distributing the buffalo meat, as things that needed to be done, that he was the person present to do, and that he did. Some of the people on whom he operated survived, some did not. The record is incomplete about specific individuals and outcomes, which is itself a reflection of the conditions under which the record was made. The main rescue wagons reached the Martin Company within days of Hanks's arrival. They reached the Willie Company at Rocky Ridge on October 21st, 2 days after the Great Storm at 6th Crossing. The rescue of the Willie Company is documented in Chislet's account with the frame-by-frame specificity that characterized his record-keeping throughout the crossing. The rescuers arrived with food, not in the quantities the company needed, because the relief party had driven hard to reach the emigrants faster than a fully loaded supply train could travel, prioritizing speed over load. They brought what they had, more than 4 ounces of flour per person per day. The Willie Company still had to cross Rocky Ridge to reach the relative protection of the valley beyond. Rocky Ridge is a high, exposed stretch of terrain where the trail climbs over a series of rough, rock-strewn slopes before descending to the valley of Rock Creek. In October, with snow on the ground and northwest wind driving without obstruction, it is brutal terrain for healthy, well-equipped travelers. For people who had been walking for 3 months on starvation rations, many of whom were frostbitten or ill, it was the final examination of the crossing. They crossed it anyway. Multiple participants and witnesses wrote accounts of the Rocky Ridge crossing after they reached the valley. The accounts agree on the essential fact. The company crossed Rocky Ridge in the night, in wind and blowing snow, carrying and supporting people who could not move under their own power. Levi Savage walked at the rear of the column, as he had walked at the rear for much of the crossing, making sure no one was left behind. He carried children. He supported elderly men and women who had walked to the absolute limit of what their bodies contained and who needed now only to be helped through the last miles to shelter. He did this for people whose leaders had overruled his warning in Iowa City and set them on the path to this night. He did it anyway, because he had said he would, and because the people who needed help needed it regardless of who had been right in July. At Rock Creek, in the valley below Rocky Ridge, the company stopped. They had crossed. And then they buried their dead. At Rock Creek, the Willie Company interred 13 people in a single grave dug in frozen ground by people who had just crossed Rocky Ridge and had, as far as physical resources went, nothing remaining. They dug it anyway. The names of those 13 people are in the company records. The youngest was 3 years old. The oldest was 67. They were from Denmark, from Scotland, from England, from Sweden. They had come from places whose names meant everything to them and nothing to the Wyoming earth that received them. The grave at Rock Creek is still there. It is marked. You can visit it today and read the names on the marker. You can stand in the Rocky Ridge terrain they crossed and feel, with your own body, something of what the ground demanded of them. Though you will feel it in summer, in good health, with food in your pack and a vehicle waiting at the trailhead. The Martin Company's ordeal continued for longer and with greater cumulative loss. The company spent time sheltered at Martin's Cove while rescue wagons caught up with them, and it was during this period that many of the worst deaths occurred. People who had been sustaining themselves through sheer forward momentum found, when the immediate demand of walking finally ceased and they were permitted to stop, that stopping was something their bodies could not reverse. The physiology of this phenomenon is documented across multiple historical episodes of extreme deprivation. The relaxation of sustained physical effort after prolonged starvation can precipitate collapse in ways that the effort itself temporarily prevented. The mortality figures for the Martin Company remain the most debated in the Handcart historical literature for reasons that reflect the difficulty of maintaining precise records during active catastrophe. The historians who have worked most carefully with the primary documents, Lydia Carter's reconstruction of company records, the Mormon Pioneer Overland travel database compiled through decades of archival research, conclude that the Martin Company lost somewhere between 135 and over 200 members out of approximately 575 to 620 who had left Iowa City. The Willie Company lost between 67 and 77. The combined toll, somewhere between 200 and 280 people, out of approximately 1,100 who had set out from Iowa City, represents a mortality rate of between 18 and 25%. More than 1 in 5, possibly more than 1 in 4. These are not abstract numbers. They are people with names in the company registers, names that the historical recovery work of the past several decades has been steadily restoring to the full record. A 3-year-old from Denmark, a 67-year-old from Scotland, a young Welsh mother who had come as far as Wyoming and could not come further. Each is a specific documented loss, and the history is most honest and most respectful to those people when it treats them as such. Among the events of the Martin Company's final Wyoming ordeal, one set of episodes has received particular attention in the historical record and in the communal memory the Latter-day Saint community has carried forward. At multiple Sweetwater River crossings, points where the current was too strong and the cold too severe for the weakest members of the company to wade safely, a group of young men in the company, many of them teenagers, carried people across. Not just children, not just the obviously frail. They waded into the October Sweetwater and carried adults, men and women who could not safely cross under their own power, on their backs and in their arms, back and forth through the current, until everyone who needed to be carried had been carried to the far bank. Multiple survivors recorded this in letters and journals written after they reached the valley. The accounts are consistent about what happened, but we do know who they were. Their names were preserved by the grateful survivors who watched them work. They were C. Allen Huntington, George W. Grant, and David P. Kimball. They waded into the freezing Sweetwater over and over, carrying nearly the entire company across on their backs. Several of these young men suffered so severely from the exposure that they were physically marked for the rest of their lives, their health broken by the very acts of care that kept the Martin Company from drowning in the ice. What the records do document is the consequence. Several of the young men who repeatedly immersed themselves in the October Sweetwater suffered severe frostbite from the repeated cold exposure. Some required amputations afterward, performed in Salt Lake City in the weeks after the companies arrived. They had paid for their act of sustained care with the specific currency of their own physical integrity, and the historical record preserved the payment without fully preserving the payers. Their names exist in family traditions and oral histories maintained by the descendant community where they were never forgotten, even when the official record failed to capture them. The rescue wagons carried the most severely ill members of both companies for portions of the remaining journey. Those who could walk at all walked, receiving food and medical assistance from the relief party along the way, but providing their own locomotion for the final hundreds of miles to the valley. The Willie Company reached Salt Lake City on November 9th and 10th, 1856. The Martin Company arrived on November 30th. By Brigham Young's instruction, the people of Salt Lake City organized themselves to receive the survivors. Families gave up rooms in their homes. Women who had never met these people, could not have communicated with many of them across language barriers, took them in and fed them. The church welfare system directed blankets, clothing, and food to the survivors with an efficiency that reflected Young's organizational capacity at its most effective. The physical injuries the survivors carried into the valley did not resolve with warmth and food. Frostbite injuries that had been managed in the field required follow-up care from valley doctors. Some extremities that had survived the trail intact could not survive the thawing that warmth brought, and amputations were performed in Salt Lake City in the weeks after the companies arrived. People who had walked to Utah on 2 feet walked through the rest of their lives on 1 or on feet that ached each winter as frostbite damage made itself felt through decades of subsequent living. Jens Nielsen, carried to safety by his wife in the handcart, received in the valley and nursed back to functional life, walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He became a bishop. He lived to old age. The limp was visible to everyone who knew him in his Utah years, and within his community it was understood as what it was: the physical record of what the winter of 1856 had cost him, and of what his wife had done to bring him through it. The question of accountability for the deaths was raised almost immediately after the survivors arrived in Salt Lake City, and it has not been fully resolved in the 170 years since. Among the survivors who reached the valley in November and December of 1856, some were grateful, some were grieving, and some were angry. The angry ones said, in private correspondence, in occasional public statements, in accounts that the official record preserved imperfectly, that the disaster had been preventable, that Levi Savage had been right, that the vote in Iowa City had been wrong, that the people who cast that vote bore responsibility for the deaths that followed. Brigham Young's public response was complex and has been the subject of sustained historical analysis. He organized the relief effort with genuine urgency and followed through on it comprehensively. He acknowledged the tragedy in terms that reflected real feeling. But he did not, in his public statements, accept organizational responsibility in the direct way that a modern institutional leader facing a comparable disaster would be expected to accept. He pointed to the later handcart companies. 7 more would complete the crossing between 1857 and 1860. As evidence that the program's design was sound. He framed the 1856 disaster as a consequence of the accumulated delays of the Atlantic crossing and the rail journey, positioning the late departure as an outcome of circumstances outside anyone's control rather than decisions within institutional control. The historical record complicates this framing. The Atlantic delays were outside anyone's control, but the decision to proceed from Iowa City in late July, made by church leaders who had heard Levi Savage's detailed, specific warning and voted against it, was a decision made by people with the authority to say stop, who did not say it. The failure to provide properly seasoned carts was an organizational failure of preparation that preceded the departure by months. These things are true. They are true alongside the genuine heroism of the relief effort, the genuine faith of the emigrants, and the genuine achievement represented by the fact that more than 800 people survived conditions that should, by objective measure, have killed far more of them. History is rarely simple enough to allow clean assignment of responsibility. What the 1856 disaster required of the people inside it, and what it requires of the historians studying it, is the capacity to hold multiple true things simultaneously without allowing any of them to cancel the others. The handcart program continued after 1856 with the corrections that experience had demanded. Carts were built from properly seasoned timber. Departures were scheduled earlier. Supply logistics were improved against the specific lessons of the Willie and Martin companies. The 7 companies that crossed between 1857 and 1860 were largely successful. lower mortality, fewer crises, the mountain passes crossed within the expected seasonal window. These later companies are almost entirely unknown outside of Latter-day Saint historical circles, precisely because they succeeded. Success leaves a quieter record than catastrophe, but they matter to the full picture. The 10 Handcart. Companies in total brought approximately 2,962 people to Utah between 1856 and 1860. The great majority arrived safely, built homes, raised families, and lived out the lives they had crossed an ocean and a continent to find. The children who had pulled handcarts across the plains grew up to be the settlers who built Utah territory. The 12-year-olds who survived Rocky Ridge became the adults who established towns and farms and schools in the valleys, spreading south and north from Salt Lake City. Their children remembered what they had done. Their children's children remembered. And the memory did not diminish with distance. It intensified, becoming one of the foundational narratives of a community's understanding of its own origins and character. The communal memory of the handcart crossing within the Latter-day Saint community is unlike the memory of almost any comparable episode in American frontier history. Most individual pioneers of the Oregon Trail are anonymous to their descendants. Their names are in the historical record for scholars, but are not carried in family consciousness with the specificity that the handcart survivors' names are carried. The handcart pioneers are known, within the community of their descendants, by name and company number and specific crossing, by cart number in some cases, by the particular moments of crisis that family oral tradition has preserved alongside the official documentation. This intensity of communal memory has preserved the story in ways that purely academic historical preservation cannot achieve. It has also inevitably shaped the story, smoothed some of its roughest edges, preserved the accounts of faith and endurance more fully than the accounts of anger and blame, elevated the most redemptive interpretations of events that admitted of multiple readings. The historical recovery work of the past several decades, by scholars like Lyndia Carter and Will Bagley, and by the researchers who built the Mormon Pioneer overland travel database over years of archival labor, has been to hold the communal narrative accountable to the documentary record, to restore the critical voices alongside the celebratory ones, to reconstruct the mortality figures with the precision the evidence allows, to give names and ages and specific fates to the people who died, not just to the people who survived, to find in the official records and in the family records and in the oral traditions the people who were angry, who felt that they had been sent into something they should not have been sent into and who said so, and to preserve their testimony alongside the testimony of those who framed the experience in terms of gratitude and spiritual sustenance. Both kinds of testimony are true. Both belong in the complete account. Today, the physical landscape of the 1856 handcart crossing is among the most accessible and carefully interpreted stretches of the Mormon Pioneer National Historic Trail, maintained by the National Park Service in partnership with the Latter-day Saint Church, running from Nauvoo, Illinois, to Salt Lake City, Utah. The grave at Rock Creek, where the Willie Company buried 13 of its members on the night of October 23, 1856, is marked and visitable. The names on the marker connect directly to the names in the company register that the exhausted clerks maintained by firelight on the Wyoming plain. The hollow, called Martin's Cove, where the Martin Company sheltered while waiting for rescue, is accessible to visitors. The Sweetwater River crossings are identifiable. In places across the Wyoming plain, the ruts of the handcart trail are visible in the earth. pressed in by thousands of feet and wheels in the 1850s, preserved by the dry, thin, unforgiving soil of the high country that has held them for 170 years. At Martin's Cove, the Latter-day Saint Church operates a visitor center. Each year, thousands of church members make the journey to Wyoming, and many of them pull replica handcarts along a section of the original trail. It is a deliberate act of communal memory, an attempt to understand through the body's experience what documents and numbers describe through the intellect. They pull the carts for a few miles on a summer afternoon. They feel the weight. They feel the resistance of the wheels in uneven ground. Their shoulders begin to ache. Their palms roughen against the wooden tongue. They do not go hungry. They do not face an October Wyoming storm on 4 ounces of flour. They do not bury anyone, but they touch the object. They feel what it resists, and some of them, by their own accounts, recorded in the visitor center logs and in the personal histories the community continues to produce, understand through that contact something about the people who walked this ground in 1856 that they could not have reached through reading alone. Bodil Mortensen was not among the survivors who looked out over the Salt Lake Valley. She died on October 23, 1856, at the camp at Rock Creek. The rescuers found her there, a girl of 14, frozen to death, still clutching a handful of sagebrush she had gathered to keep her company's fire alive. She was placed in the common grave at Rock Creek with 12 others. She never married, never saw the Zion she had walked so far to find, and never knew that her name would become a symbol for an entire generation of pioneers. She didn't reach the valley, but she stayed with her people until the very end. Levi Savage walked every mile with the Willie Company. He reached Salt Lake City in November 1856 and continued his life in Utah, serving in various church capacities for the decades that followed the crossing. His journal was preserved by his family and eventually donated to archives where historians could access it. He never publicly retracted his warning. He never publicly claimed vindication. He seems, from the evidence of how he conducted himself in the years after 1856, to have understood that he had done what he could do, that others had made different decisions for reasons he understood even when he disagreed with them, and that the people who had died with as much dignity as the mountain would allow, and that this was the specific form of outcome his situation had been capable of producing. He had been right about the danger. He had also been right to stay. Both of these things were true, and neither one canceled the other, and living with both of them simultaneously was what the situation had demanded of him. The Wyoming ground that received the dead of 1856 is unchanged. The Sweet Water still runs cold from its mountain sources toward the plains. The ridgeline of Rocky Ridge presents the same silhouette against the same enormous sky that it presented to the Willie Company in the night of October 22nd. In November, the wind still comes off the peaks without apology, at temperatures that stop conversation and require the body's full attention just to keep moving. And in the community that carries these stories forward, in the families whose great-great-grandparents pushed those wooden carts across the Continental Divide on 4 ounces of flour a day, the names of the dead are still spoken aloud. At Martin's Cove, at Rock Creek, at the sites along the trail where the company register notes a death and a burial. The names are read not because speaking them changes what happened, but because the act of naming the dead is how communities maintain their obligation to the past, not to the sanitized version of it, not to the version that makes everything come out clean and meaningful in the end, to the actual past, the one with the frozen axles and the failing tents and the vote in Iowa City that Levi Savage lost, and the people who died because of it, and the people who carried those people's bodies to the grave and then picked up the cart handle and kept walking. The endurance was real. The faith that sustained it was genuine and operative in ways the historical record documents even for readers who do not share it. The organizational failures that placed people in those conditions were also real and are also documented. The heroism of the Sweetwater Crossings and the Rocky Ridge Night March, and the Elsie Nielsens who put their frostbitten husbands in the cart and pulled, that heroism is as well documented as anything in the frontier record. The dead are in the Wyoming ground. The living built a territory and raised children who are alive today and who know their grandmother's cart numbers. The story is large enough to hold all of it. If this story has moved you, please leave a like so others can find it. Thank you for spending time with Western Pioneer. Archives.